Inside the Borg and free from the hive mind, this is Rex Bear hosting Leak Project. The Leak Project was created to offer awareness and information not found in the mainstream news. With over 90% of the world's media controlled by only 6 enormous conglomerates, many people today are looking for more accurate information. The Leak Project offers a refreshing approach to the brain-drained media. Check back daily for new content as we thrive to bring you the cutting edge in news, current events, on-scene video footage, interviews, and most importantly, the truth.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We have a real treat for you this evening. We have Marshall Klarfeld. He graduated with an engineering degree from Caltech in 1951 after studying under such luminaries as Nobel laureate Professors Richards, Feynman, and Linus Pauling. Fascinated by what he considered advanced scientific knowledge in the Bible's story of creation, Klarfeld embarked on a quest to unravel the mysteries surrounding humanity's early history. AdamTheMissingLink.com is his website. If you'd like to check out his work, please go there. It's great to have you on, Marshall. How are you doing?
I'm doing just fine.
Thank you so much for joining us. We have a ton of listeners on right now that are absolutely enthralled with the Anunnaki, ancient aliens. It looks like you've got some pretty intense work that you recently came out with, and I was wondering if you could share some of that with us.
Certainly. I've been studying the Anunnaki for about the last 15 years, Rex, and my latest book called The Mysteries of Alien Technology just came out in a month or so ago, and I'm revealing some really astounding new discoveries. I'm always on the cutting edge looking for what I think is evidence that this advanced space age civilization called the Anunnaki were here on the planet Earth maybe 400,000 years ago, and they colonized our planet, and they did some marvelous constructions, and also were very instrumental in producing the human race, Homo sapiens.
Well, back when Zecharia Sitchin came out with his works, claiming that the Anunnaki came here approximately 350,000 years ago and turned, I think it was Homo erectus, or the current, I guess you could call it Earth man, Earth being, into Homo sapiens with a DNA engineering to go after gold and other resources. Yes, sir. So is that the same information you have found? Does that back up what he says, or are there some differences?
Oh, yeah, no. Let's get the record straight here, Rex. I'm a disciple of Zecharia Sitchin. In other words,
okay.
I was wandering around for years. It all started with me in 1947 when Roswell happened. I happened to have entered Caltech that fall, and that's all we talked about were UFOs and aliens. So my interest in the subject goes way back to the Roswell incident. And over the years, I had a career in business, but I was always interested in where we came from. And I discovered Zechariah's work about 1999 and became a friend of his, a student of his. I studied under him for 10 years. And now that he's no longer with us, I'm kind of carrying the torch. And I'm a strong proponent of what his 15 books revealed to us. And in my 4 books, I've kind of pushed the envelope out further. I wish he was here to share with me the discoveries that have come up. But since he isn't, I'm going to share it with your audience.
Fantastic. We are really looking forward to it. One of the questions that I have always asked is, we supposedly only use approximately 10% of our brain. There's the majority of our DNA, the scientists call it junk DNA because they don't know what it does. And there are ancient texts and writings and people that have been a part of mystery societies, mystery schools, etc., that have had stories passed down to them where they talk about the people of Earth thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago, and how they were more I guess you could say, in tune with nature and spirituality. And a species of space beings came down and manipulated them. And I wonder, did they make us smarter, or did they actually devolve the race into more of a controllable species?
Well, the way I see the translations, I use a database, by the way, Rex, of the Sumerian cuneiform tablets and the Sumerian cylinder seals. The information that Zecharia revealed from translating these tablets and interpreting the pictures on the cylinder seals is a database that I work on. I'm kind of a reporter. I do investigative research and I report what I find. And from that background, I can give you the story that I feel very comfortable with. And that is that Homo sapiens are only about 200,000 years old. The first skeletal remains were found in Southeast Africa of what the species called Homo sapiens. The species that preceded Homo sapiens was Homo erectus. And Homo erectus had been evolving on planet Earth for over 1,800,000 years. They kind of were a creature that looked like us. They walked upright and they developed tools, but the tools advanced only to spears and stones. And their brain capacity was a third our size. Now, if evolution produced our species, Homo sapiens, there would be skeletal remains shown between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, but there aren't any. In other words, the species that you and I are part of, Homo sapiens, appears out of kind of nowhere 200,000 years ago, and the story in the cuneiform tablets coincides with that event in that I'm talking about the Anunnaki, this advanced space-age civilization that had been colonizing the Earth for, like you said, 350 to 400,000 years, took and upgraded Homo erectus. In other words, they built a bicameral species by taking the egg from the female Homo erectus and scooping out the nucleus and putting their DNA in there and planting it in one of the Anunnaki females, birth mother. And the product of that procedure, genetic engineering, was Adam. They called him Adamu, and there are cylinder seals that show this process, which I portray in my books. By the way, my books are different than most folks. They are 8.5 by 11, Rex, and they're filled with colored pictures. My last book has over 170 color pictures, which show the evidence, the irrefutable physical evidence that I've discovered that this advanced civilization was truly here, and it was remarkable the things that they were able to create besides creating the bicameral species Homo sapien, Adam. And from the beginning, the story goes, they also created a female called Eve, but the problem with these bicameral procedures was that they were sterile. In other words, if you take a horse and a donkey and mate them, you'll get a mule. And mules are sterile. They can't reproduce themselves. So that's a similar situation that we've had here. And so we have the story of Adam's rib in the Bible, which was a kind of a retelling of what the original story was in the cuneiform tablets, that in order to make Eve fertile, they had to do a four-way operation in which they took marrow from Adam's rib and somehow manipulated Eve to create a fertile female so that the humans could then reproduce themselves and the Anunnaki birth mothers were given a rest. So that's the story that comes from the beginning, and that's really where our species was launched 200,000 years ago. There was another intervention later on, I think perhaps after the flood, that created an advanced species called Homo sapiens sapiens. And that's what you and I are, Rex. We are not Homo sapiens, we're Homo sapiens sapiens, which is thinking man. So this, according to the cuneiform records, was accomplished by a direct mating of an Anunnaki male with a human female. And the result of that production was Homo sapiens sapiens, which was much more intelligent than the first models, the Homo sapiens, Adam and Eve.
The Homo erectus, 400,000 years ago, one thing I've always wondered is if we did evolve from that, we were changed genetically from that, which would explain the jump, and that does make a lot of sense. Wouldn't there still be other species out there today like the ones back then if they weren't genetically modified? Because obviously the Anunnaki couldn't have modified everybody, right?
No, that's true. Well, they did a lot of experiments. They came up with a lot of really bad results, and according to the records, if you read it and read Sitchin's work, he goes into great detail on how they kept fooling around and trying to make a primitive worker. Their object, according to the cuneiform tablets, was they came to Earth in the pursuit of gold. They needed gold to heal the atmosphere of their planet, which goes way past Pluto in an elliptical orbit around the sun. And because the atmosphere is the only thing that holds them together, they had developed an ozone leak, and they needed to seal it up to save themselves. So the object of their adventure here to planet Earth was to take the gold and send it back home and close the ozone leak. But the species on Earth, all species on Earth, according to most researchers, develop very slowly, Rex. In other words, evolution is an extremely slow process. For instance, if you look at Homo erectus, for 1,800,000 years, they evolved perhaps from another branch of the primate tree, and the evolution apparently kind of came to a halt. The furthest they got to was walking upright, using wooden spears and stone tools. And by the way, they had no vocal cords. They couldn't speak. They grunted. So that when the next species arrives, Homo sapiens, we have an intelligent, upright species that is able to talk and able to take commands and to be a primitive worker, which was the goal that the Anunnakis had in creating Homo sapiens.
I see. So do you kind of go along the reference then of some of the texts out of the Bible, for example, Genesis, does talk about how, at least the version we have now, because there's been so many translations and particular words have been added and taken out of the current, I guess you could say, canon of, basically the Old Testament, the New Testament. So,
you look at this. Genesis is what I was a student of the Bible before I got into this, so I'm quite familiar with what it says in the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
And if you look at Genesis 6:4, it says, the Nephilim were upon the earth in those days, and they coveted the daughters of man and had intercourse with them and created the giants of old. And the question that Zecharia asked himself originally was, who were the Nephilim? And why doesn't the Bible go on to explain these were the sons of God? In some translations, you get the phrase they were the sons of gods, plural.
Right.
And that kind of raised a lot of questions that biblical scholars kind of avoid, or they don't deal with it directly. But Zecharia took it head on, and I agree with him that I think the reference in Genesis 6:4 to the Nephilim were those who from heaven to earth came. And these indeed were the Anunnaki, and the giants of old were the hybrids that they created, like Atlas and Hercules and Goliath. They were giants because apparently the main species, the Anunnaki main species, according to the cuneiform tablets and the cylinder seals, were giants. They were like 9 feet tall as a species. So if you bred a 9-foot tall Anunnaki with a human, which in those days were only about 5 feet tall, you got in between. You got these giants. And we have the story of David slaying Goliath, and the Greeks had great references to the heroes of their civilization who were also very large species.
Now, when you talk about Adam and Eve and the manipulation of their genetics in order to be able to reproduce, and then you have other factions that are talked about, like the adversary per se. Could you get into the names of the adversary, or if there is one, and explain that in detail in reference to the texts that you've had the opportunity to translate?
Well, here's what most people can't grasp. There's a couple of things. First, that the species Homo sapiens sapiens came near to extinction 11,500 years ago when the Great Flood occurred. In other words, the population that had evolved on the planet was totally decimated by this event and started over again. So any other species that were around couldn't survive either, and they were wiped out. So I think you should probably trace your genealogy from about 11,000 years ago, when after the flood, the earth was covered with 10 miles of mud, and anything that lived on the surface needed help to survive. There was no food, there were no animals to use for food, and you couldn't grow plants because it was just an impossible situation. And according to the great epic story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh goes into great detail as to what the Anunnaki did after the flood to help the survivors reproduce and continue to survive on the planet. They brought down trees, they brought down animals, and they brought down domesticated wheat. There's evidence of that. 9,000-year-old domesticated wheat found on Mount Ararat. So there are bits and snatches of evidence here and there that apparently, with the aid of an outside advanced civilization, those survivors of the flood 11,500 years ago started over again. And here we are now. There were many catastrophes that happened prior to the flood, but let's just talk about the species that remained after the flood. And there were some, and there are still some, aboriginal species that live in remote places like in New Guinea and in South America and other parts of the world where they've been untouched by outside interference, and they're living in the Stone Age. There are, tribes of aboriginals that are just didn't have any reason to become civilized. They just stayed in the Stone Age level. So you have to believe, as I do, Rex, that there's been technology transfer going on throughout the course of human events, which has aided our species to advance to where we are now today. That we didn't do it on our own. It didn't happen naturally like evolution would. There were injections of advanced technology and perhaps DNA manipulation, which brought us up to the level where, if you look at the scheme of things, Rex, if it took Homo erectus 1,800,000 years to get to the advanced tool making of stones and spears, we're only 200,000 years old as a species, and we're walking on the moon in 1969. Now, that does not happen in evolution. That could not happen. It's too quick. It's too much of an advance, and so you have to factor in this outside manipulation and interference by an advanced species.
Well, and that definitely would explain this sudden jump in technology and the change in DNA so drastically with the skeletal remains that are found, etc. The question is, now you've got, basically almost 7 billion people on the planet, and there's, so much going on as far as consumerism and things that seem to be affecting Europe. Obviously, whether you believe in geoengineering with chemtrails or a lot of the fracking that's going on, the nuclear catastrophe that happened with Fukushima recently. So with all of this going on, is this just kind of something that's going to cleanse the earth again of the current race, and there's going to be a new species brought into play, possibly with the help of the Anunnaki?
Well, that's a very good question, Rex. You've touched on something that I've done a lot of thinking about and that I discussed with Zecharia. And most people are under the impression that we have to wait until Nibiru returns before the Anunnaki can come back and interfere with us again. But that's not true. If you read the text as I have and as Zecharia did, they seem to have phased off the planet after they thought we were sufficiently advanced to take care of ourselves and take care of the planet. And they did so in the mothership. There was a mothership orbiting Earth when they colonized us. And that was the source of their technology and their resources. And when they took off, they took the mothership with them, and it could be hanging out as close by as say, Mercury. If that's true, the return of this species to interfere again with Earthlings is not impossible in a very short period of time. And I believe that since there were two factions of the Anunnaki. One was headed up by the firstborn son of their king. His name was Enki. And the other faction was headed up by Enlil, who was the second-born son of Enlil and the direct heir to the throne. And they entered into kind of a conflict over the period of time. And it was Enki, the firstborn, who saved humans during the flood. That's in the story. By the way, I've written a book with my wife, Mary. It's called Gilgamesh 10, which is a screenplay of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it brings to life what life was like 4,600 years ago here on Earth when they cohabitated, when the Anunnaki cohabitated with humans, and the humans knew them as flesh and blood beings. And they weren't gods at that time. They were lords, overlords, because they were more powerful. But this story, and I recommend it to your readers, you can go to my AdamTheMissingLink.com webpage and you'll see it's available in a 8.5 by 11 book form with colored pictures showing physical evidence that the story may be a true story. And the story of the events after the flood shows definitively that Enki was the force that saved humans from the devastation following the flood. And I think, and I'm a positive kind of a person, that if we get into such trouble, it's like we are right now, we're on the kind of the tipping point of our civilization. We've got the ability to totally obliterate ourselves as a civilization. If things get out of hand, that could happen. But I think if there is going to be another return of the Anunnaki, the intervention, and if it's by Enki, would be to save us from ourselves. Because in effect, I look at it as we are their experiment, their prodigy now. If they want to keep us going and keep Earth going, it's in their best interest to prevent us from destroying each other. And there's a very interesting question that goes along with this, Rex. And for your listeners, I would advise them to think about this. We don't know who created the Anunnaki. We don't know where they came from. They apparently are maybe 1 million years more advanced than we are, and I'm sure there are other species out in the universe that are extraterrestrial life forms, aliens. But the only evidence that I have and that Zecharia produced was the database of what this species left here on planet Earth, the physical evidence, the pyramids, many stone structures that are magnificent in their accomplishment and in their architecture and their design that we couldn't have done 2,000 years ago, and some of us maybe couldn't do it today, which to me is the proof positive of an advanced civilization, and I call them the Anunnaki, that were here on planet Earth. Now, they had a deity. I think people should know that this advanced species wasn't totally without faith or I don't know if I'd call it a religion, but they had a deity that they called the creator of all. And obviously they faced up to the same question, Rex, that we face into is, where did we come from? How did the universe come to be? These are questions that are almost impossible to answer, so you have to have some kind of maybe faith-based story to help you live with those thoughts. What do you think?
Well, I feel that if it took us only 200,000 years, approximately 300,000 years to advance to where we are now, and then just the past 12,000 years to get to where we are now, if evolution is such a slow process, and they are approximately 1 million years ahead of us technologically, and they created us to where we can think for ourselves to this point and be as articulate as we are, then maybe something interfered with them. That would make me ask, how long have they been around?
We don't know.
You know?
The only evidence we have of their appearance here on planet Earth apparently started with their colonization of our planet for the sole purpose of seeking gold. There were no humans 400,000 years ago, and for 200,000 years they were colonizing the Earth with their people, And they built their cities. The pre-diluvial cities existed in a place called Mesopotamia. And there's evidence we dug up the remains of those cities. And that civilization was flourishing for hundreds of thousands of years before we appeared. Now, we appeared 200,000 years ago by their interference or intervention, if you want to call it. And so the new species, which came along slowly, but gradually was given more technical information transferred to us, as we can see in our history that when an advanced civilization encounters a primitive one, they always transfer the technology. And that repeats itself over and over again. So I assume that's what happened to us when they did that. And finally they phased off the planet when they felt that, we were capable of taking care of ourselves. Well, I don't think we're doing a very good job, Rex. I think we haven't really taken care of our home planet, and we certainly have developed a nasty habit of killing each other. And that's really not a good way to advance as a civilization. So I think there's some positive things that the story that you and I are talking about may bring about. The fact that if we learn from the history, we will maybe prevent the mistakes of the past, and our future will be secure. But I do think that we need to know this story, and most people don't. And that's why I'm glad to give you this interview, because I'm sharing with your audience information that is not available in school textbooks.
It's not. Right.
People like yourself who are investigative types who go for the spectacular unknown events are bringing forward the story of where civilization came from. And the Sumerians are the first civilization. And I spend quite a bit of time in my books explaining this, and they aren't terribly difficult to read. The reason I put all the pictures in them is that I think a picture's worth maybe 10,000 words. And if I say a little something and I show you a picture, it'll get you thinking that maybe that's true. Maybe that could have happened. And I let you make up your own mind. I'm not a preacher. I don't come forward and say this is what it is and this is what you have to believe. I just say these are the facts that I've found. This is what I've discovered. And I'm sharing with you in my books what I think is something we all need.
So, Marshall, let's get back into, if we could please, these two different factions that basically went after Earth and the control of this council. I guess you could call it Galactic Council. Are they referred to as different names in, obviously, the Bible and different mythology?
Yes. I think if you look at the pantheon of the Sumerian civilization, what's amazing about the Sumerians, Rex, is that they appear out of nowhere, like 9,000 years ago, 6,000 to 9,000 years ago. This civilization arrives with all of the first. In other words, they came out of the caves. They've got a language that is written. They've got poetry. They've got mathematics, physics, chemistry, astrology, astronomy, music, schools, and religion. So that doesn't happen in history. You just don't have a civilization blossom like the Sumerians did, with streets that were regularly laid out in a format just like you would have a city in New York. And you got to ask yourself, how did that happen? How did the Sumerians do what they did? And here's what they said. In everything that they wrote in the cuneiform tablets about their civilization and the things that they had, they credited it to this Anunnaki. They said everything we had was given to us by the Anunnaki. So to me, that's a statement of technology transfer, of jump-starting civilization. Now, the two factions that were the head of that pantheon, there were 12 leaders. The top guy was Enlil, and his number, they did this thing by numbers. He had number 60, number 50. Anu, the king from back in the home planet, was a 60. Enlil was 50, and Enki was 40. And this is kind of an interesting way of giving power to people, but the reason why there was the conflict between the firstborn son, Enki, who came here first to Earth, and the secondborn son, Enlil, who was the direct descendant of the king and the queen. So they had a pure bloodline. Actually, the king married his sister. So Enlil was born from the union of Anu and his spouse, his wife. Enki was born from Anu and a concubine who was a royal person with good blood, but wasn't a pure direct line. So all of a sudden we've got set up here a scenario where the firstborn son, who should normally be successor to the throne, is not, because of their rules. The second-born, pure blood, Enlil, is the direct heir to the throne. So we set up a situation where the firstborn, Enki, is the smartest of the two of them, I think. He was, although they're both very, very powerful beings in their own right. They had organizational abilities and engineering talents that were beyond compare. But what started out as a kind of a joint venture became a challenge. And I think the king, Anu, knew that his two sons were going to be rivals. And the stories are fascinating. I encourage people to get into this history of the Anunnaki, because it's fascinating how the lives and the machinations that took place trying to be successor to the king, you know, I want to be the next ruler scenario, produced lots of conflict, lots of confrontations, and indeed ended up 4,000 years ago in the first atomic war on the planet Earth. That's a fascinating story. There was it wasn't Enlil and Enki directly, but it was their sons that used 7 atomic weapons that had been secretly hidden here on the planet Earth. That's another story. They were used, and in the Bible you have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the 2 cities that God destroyed. And if you read in detail in the Bible the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and you read the story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and you'll see exactly the same portrayal. This was atomic warfare which wiped out those 2 cities, plus some strategic spaceport things. And it was all part of this rivalry between the Enlil clan and the Enki clan. Now, what is fascinating to me is that this pantheon, these 12 leaders, trace their history for 6,000 years through every civilization. After the Sumerians, you get to the Egyptians, you get to the Babylonians, the Akkadians, Hebrews, all the way down to the Romans, the Greeks and the Romans. In the Romans, you have a leader worshipped by the Romans. His name is Jupiter, and he's the commander. And his brother is Neptune, and Neptune is the water god. And back in the beginning, Enlil was the commander, and Enki was the water god. And then you go to the Greeks, and you get Zeus, who's the commander, and his brother Poseidon, who's the water god. And they have the same characters, no, they have the same physical attributes, they have the same qualities, they have the same leadership and powers that are traced for 6,000 years from the Sumerian civilization all the way up to the Romans. They have different names, but I believe the one thing that is most difficult for us to understand is how people could live, or how physical beings, flesh and blood beings, could live for thousands of years. They age hundreds of thousands of years. They age, but they age slowly. And we see this in the depiction in the cylinder seals of what they look like. So I explain all of this in my first book, Adam the Missing Link, and I go on in the second book, Gilgamesh 10, to tell the story of the first written story on the planet, which reveals the story of the flood. And in my third book, The Anunnaki Were Here, I reveal a new theory that I came up with that I wasn't able to share with Zecharia because he was gone by the time I produced that book. It's called washboard gold mining. theory that I have of step pyramids being used to separate placer gold from river water that contain gold particles. And in my fourth book, Mysteries of the Alien Technology, I go on to explain how they collected the gold from these washboard monuments, from the great pyramids like Sitchin and Tiwanaku, etc. It's a fascinating story, and I think I've maybe uncovered some information that eventually will be accepted by the archaeological community as a reason why these structures were built. They were actually gold mining facilities.
Now, there seems to be this fascination around human sacrifice and other sacrifice in religions and cultures, and Chichen Itza, the Mayan ruins, etc. So what does that connect to the Anunnaki in any way?
They never did that. No, there was never in the stories that we have from the database of the cuneiform tablets and the Sumer seals, human sacrifice was not at all a part of the Anunnaki culture. Matter of fact, they had kind of a credo that they didn't kill each other. That if you got really in trouble, if you did bad things and were found to be guilty of bad things, you got exiled. They sent your ways and never without power and without support. That was the punishment. Later on, of course, the younger generation of Anunnaki became more belligerent, and they did have wars and they did kill each other. But the human sacrifice, I think, developed from Homo sapiens idea of how do you connect with the gods. In other words, they knew about these advanced species. They knew about the Anunnaki. They eventually had morphed from lords into demigods and then into gods. And because they needed help from them, they would do things like human sacrifice to try to please what they thought was what the gods wanted. I don't know where that came from. I really haven't traced that very much, Rex, but it wasn't part of the kingship that the Anunnaki used in their own civilization, and the religions that they introduced into the human civilization were all control mechanisms. If you have a small, strong body of powerful people who have to control masses, you need some mechanisms. And the first mechanism that they introduced was kingship, and the second one was religion. And these were definitely control mechanisms, but there was no sacrifice of human beings as a part of that endeavor.
Yeah, I see. And, it's interesting too, because you're talking about the pantheons and the different gods and deities. Earlier you were talking about some of the manipulations, the genetic manipulations that were taking place, and some of these things that were created that shouldn't have been probably. I wonder if that might explain some of the myths of the monsters and stuff in the folklore.
Well, yes, I think that we're talking about thousands of years of civilizations, and you're talking about a species that came from kind of a jumpstart situation, then a kind of a slave environment in which they were used as primitive workers, and then given a little bit of freedom and some technology transfer and some rules like kingship and then religion. This took thousands of years, and it's hard for us, I think, Rex, to understand. I mean, we're talking about 30, 40, 50 years. We can understand what goes on in that time frame. 100 years is difficult to understand. But you talk about thousands of years, all kinds of things could happen. And the record, frankly, is not that complete in that the translations don't cover everything. They give you a kind of a glimpse into what life was like when they were coexisting, when the Anunnaki were in charge and the humans were subservient to them. And they did eventually develop worship for them, and then they had different, they worshipped Enlil first, and they, found other images to worship. And if you were a citizen in Rome, you had multiple gods, 12, 15, 20 gods that you would pay homage to. But they all were characterizations from the original Anunnakis.
Could you explain some of the different technologies and stuff that you write about that they had accesses to?
Yes, okay. Let's take the Egyptians first, or actually you could take the Sumerians. The Sumerians built things called ziggurats. They look like pyramids, only they were made out of mud bricks, and they were very tall, multi-story, up to 40 feet high, and they had stairways, and they've uncovered some of these and reconstructed them. But when you get to Egypt, Egyptian civilization occurred about 300 years after the beginning of the Sumerian civilization. And during the course of their beautiful, magnificent history, we had the pyramids. Now, the pyramids are huge stone structures put together with precision-cut stones placed one atop another without any mortar. This is kind of an interesting building technique. Most modern-day constructions things are held together with steel rebars or concrete and are blocks of mortar. The buildings that we see from the Egyptians and also the Sumerians were made out of stones, and they were not easy to cut stones. These were made out of heavy, almost granite-like textures. And granite is very difficult to manipulate. It takes special tooling. And we know the Egyptians only had bronze and copper tools, and there was no way you're going to cut a granite stone with bronze and copper tools. So you had to say somebody else did this in conjunction maybe with the Egyptian population.
You know, also
There's evidence all over the place, Rex, of advanced construction techniques and technology in these buildings, in the pyramids alone. The inside of the Great Pyramid is one of the most magnificent constructions that you could imagine. I'm sure you've seen pictures of the inside.
Oh, yeah.
And I have. And I've analyzed, many people have tried to figure out what the Grand Gallery was, what the King's Chamber was, what the Queen's Chamber was, what the pit was, and all these tunnels that were drilled 4 feet by 4 feet through solid granite, 300 feet. You know, it's something that you couldn't do with the tools that were available to the Egyptians. It's impossible.
Oh, sure. And then there's the Bosnian pyramid, which is 12,500 years old, that has incredible sculptures of onyx that are just giant in size, incredible architecture. Yeah, Machu Picchu. So it's interesting that you bring up the I guess you could say the children of the Anunnaki, or the with humans that were making these giants, or these that you're talking about. They found skeletons of 9 feet, 8 feet of old. So that's pretty remarkable. Now, one of our listeners was hoping that you could discuss more of the gold mining that went on in South Africa.
Yes, good question. Okay. Originally, they tried to siphon gold from the base. They landed in the Persian Gulf, and the Tigris-Euphrates rivers carried gold, placer gold, down from the Turkey, what today is Turkish mountains, and in the river water. Nature has a way of stripping gold by water running over it and picking it up and taking it down the rivers. So they thought that they could mine the bottom of the Persian Gulf and get the gold there, but they found out they got a whole bunch of other stuff when they were vacuuming up the silt from the bottom of the Persian Gulf. So they needed a more direct way to get it, and they did a survey. Enki went south, and he found gold veins in southeast Africa. So they started the traditional ground mining of gold. They dug tunnels and down to, I think, as deep as it is today, 2 miles below the surface of the earth, to extract gold, which then was in rock form. It was mixed up with rocks, and so you had to break up the rocks, and you had to smelt it. And, it's a real process, just like we do today, the same kind of thing. But what happened at the flood, Rex, was that these mines were inundated with mud. They were absolutely all buried. So they had to find another way, and it was kind of tedious to do it that way. So they discovered that they could separate the gold from the placer water. There's placer water all over the planet that is stripping gold from the veins and bringing it downstream. And the way gold is 19 times heavier than water. So if you recall the old gold mining days in California, they had sluice boxes. And the sluice box is where you take the sludge in the riverbeds where the gold was coming down, and you have a washboard in the sluice, and there's a slurry goes down, hits the washboard. The banging activity of the washboard knocks the gold down into the slots. So then you can just wash away the mud and the water, and you have gold captured in this washboard sluice box. And that means of separating, I've speculated and written about and shown proof, I think, was done by the Anunnaki on a grand scale, way beyond anything anybody before has imagined. For instance, let's take Sitchin. You're familiar with that pyramid down there?
Absolutely.
Okay, it's a step pyramid, and there's a little house on the top of the step pyramid, and next to it is a cenote, which was a underwater river. In Mexico, there's a lot of underwater rivers that take alluvium filled with gold and placer water, and it goes underground. And I have evidence in my third book, The Anunnaki Were Here, of a huge port down in that water hole where they sucked up the placer water and pumped it up to the top of the Chichen Itza pyramid and let it flow over the edges, and the steps of the step pyramid were the collection surfaces. And in that book, I wondered, I didn't pronounce anything, is how they collected the gold after it had separated on these surfaces. Now in the fourth book, Mysteries of the Anunnaki, I discovered the ancient Greek myth of Jason and the Golden Fleece. And I did research on the Golden Fleece, and there's a place, Sochi, where they had the Winter Olympics, which is a gold-filled region in the Caucasus of the Russians, on the Black Sea, where gold just streams out into the water, and they collected it by using sheepskin. They take a sheepskin, it's mounted on a board, and they hold it in the river streams, and the sheep fibers of the sheepskin have lanolin-like qualities, and the gold particles would adhere to the fibers of the sheepskin, and eventually you'd have a golden fleece, which was the story of Jason the Argonauts and the Golden Fleece. So I know from my research that many of the Romans and the Greeks were mining gold using sheepskins, and I've come to the realization that was the same technique that was used by the Anunnaki to cover the surfaces of their washboard monuments, the step pyramids, the hundreds and thousands of step pyramids in Central and South America, and the Greek amphitheater on Sicily, and many others. Even the Great Wall of China, I point out in one of my books, were used as placer washboard gold mining devices. And it just all fits together because there's now a big furor going on in Southeast Africa about these stone circles. They're corral-like structures that Michael Tillinger talks about a lot. And I've analyzed and found similar circular stone structures in Syria and in Peru as there are in Africa. And these were, in effect, sheepfolds. They raised sheep in these enclosures, and separating them out as we do today. And these sheepfolds produced the millions of pelts that were necessary to collect the gold from the Anunnaki washboard gold mining facilities around the world. And I put together in my fourth book the final piece of the puzzle, and it solves, I think, many of the questions that are being raised today about what were all these stone circles about. And I've come to the realization that they were places that had to raise these millions of sheep because they needed lots of pelts.
I see.
How about that?
That's something else. And interesting too, when you talk about Chichen Itza and the step pyramids, the possibility of it, separating the golds and such. Now, when you get into the Egyptian pyramids again, and the way that they're aligned with particular star constellations, do you feel that that's possibly where the Anunnaki came from?
Yes, I think there's a direct correlation with the Orion belt and the Orion constellation. The three center stars are a direct mirror image of the placement of the pyramids on the Giza Plateau, and also the Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, and the Pyramid of Quetzalcoatl in Tiwanaku. This is a repetition of perhaps an indication of the origin of where their planet came from. But also I have analyzed in the third book the interior of the Great Pyramids. All the passages and the chambers are watertight, Rex, and there was no reason to build watertight passages inside of a pyramid unless you were going to put water in them. And I show by graphic illustration in my books how this was a gigantic hydraulic pulse pump. The water came down the entrance into the pit and was, before we had electricity, there was a thing called a hydraulic pulse pump, which pumped water up without any outside power source. And this is what they used to drive the water up into the Grand Gallery. And the Grand Gallery, if you look at it, is an upside-down step pyramid. The walls are cobbled as you go up in the Grand Gallery, and the water surged up into the Grand Gallery and into the King's Chamber, and it was knocking the gold down into the 27 slots on the Grand Gallery floor, where probably had sheepskins in them, and they collected gold that way. And part of the evidence that I bring forward is that there's a sarcophagus in the King's Chamber. And I've often been fascinated by that box because it's sitting there. Of course, there was never found any pharaoh's tomb or remains in it. It wasn't a burial chamber, but it was some kind of device. And I show by pictures how the edges, the outside edges of this box are totally destroyed by some kind of hammering action, that every edge is not pointed like it should be. It's smashed in. And according to Archimedes' principle, anything that's hollow will float. So my assumption is that when the water got to the King's Chamber, it floated this sarcophagus and it banged against the walls inside of the King's Chamber until it was chipped and damaged, and water finally came into it, and it sunk and it landed where it is now in the King's Chamber. So I have some really strong physical evidence to support my theories, and I would ask any of those who are interested to explore these and prove that I'm wrong. I've challenged the scientific community in a documentary film that I'm about to produce, and I put a short segment of it out there for people to see, where I articulate this washboard gold mining theory by the Anunnaki, and I show examples, and I actually physically, a couple of years ago, went to the Greek amphitheater in Sicily and proved that structure was originally a washboard gold mining structure before it became an amphitheater. It's kind of fascinating stuff.
Well, and there's always been such a fascination around gold, even to this day. It's interesting to wonder, though, why they would, if they came to Earth and they manipulated the Earth people to be basically what we are now or close to it, to do their work for them, then did they just get all the gold that they needed, or were they like, well, wait a second, we made these, we created a being that can think for itself to the point to where we shouldn't interfere, we shouldn't be their master, like, for example, somebody having a pet dog or something?
Yeah, well, you've touched on a couple of subjects that are near and dear to me. I talked at length with Zecharia Sitchin about what did they do with all the extra gold they were getting, because all those years of mining our gold, it was more than enough to close the ozone leak on their home planet. So there had to be some other use for it. And recently, I think it was Graham Hancock or one of those folks over there found what was called a monatomic processing plant on Mount Herod in Sinai. so that we know that you can convert gold into monatomic particles, what calls white powder gold, and there are folks who are ingesting this material because they claim it prolongs your life. And it may have been that they, because of the adverse effects of our temperature cycle and our gravitational cycle compared to their home planet, they were aging much more rapidly than they normally would have been at home. So they were looking for means to slow down their aging process, and they may have used the extra gold as a monatomic ingestion process. I don't know. I'm speculating on that, Rex, but it's possible.
Sure. Well,
I've used it.
Right, and I've definitely heard of monatomic gold, and I have heard stories of doctors that tried it on patients that were terminally ill, and it completely got rid of all of the disease and illness, and they were healed. Now, this is just stuff that I've heard, so I can't verify any of that, obviously.
I can't verify that, Rex, either. And I have a friend, very good friend of mine, who's in the field that I'm in, and he's ingesting it. He's a little bit younger than I am. And I keep saying, Neil, how's it going? And he says, it's great. So,
it's great. But he hasn't been able,
I don't think I'd try it.
I know people that have, I know people that have considered trying it. However, if you're going to do something like that and you want to prove that it works, maybe have your blood tested after you do it. Who knows what that's going to do to the nervous system. So, it's, obviously something to take.
Known.
Right. Now, one of the things that our listeners are wondering is back, thousands of years ago, some of the pharaohs actually were literally cone heads, and other people or tribes around the world have deformed their heads, directly on purpose. Yeah.
Its skull, make them look pointed. Yeah, I think there is some validity to the fact that their species may have had cone-shaped craniums. I've never really proven that. There are folks out there in my field who are uncovering these skulls all over the place, and some of them they claim are natural, and some of them were deformed by their mothers. But if you look at the evolution of our species, it's highly possible, Rex, that we will eventually, as we use more than the 10% of our gray matter, we'll need a larger shell to contain it as it grows and becomes more powerful. And we have pictures in Egypt of Akhenaten, who was kind of an interesting pharaoh, and he started a whole new religion. But all the depictions of him are with a pointy skull, and his queen had a pointy skull. And so the artifacts from the Sumerian civilization show them wearing helmets. They always had their heads covered with these horned helmets, which the number of horns was kind of a rank. If you had 2 horns, you were 20. If you had 4 horns, you were 40. And 1 horn, you're 15. But they covered up their heads in these magnificent helmets, and they kind of had space age connotations to them, because there was a statue discovered of Ishtar, this female Anunnaki, 1930 in a place in Syria. They found a life-size statue. And in this life-size statue, she's wearing this helmet, which they called Shudaru, which translates into goes far into the universe, and it had horns on it, and it had all kinds of implements on it that made it look like they were covering up their head as it needed protection. Like we have, our spacesuits have kind of round bowling ball helmets on them. But
right.
Their helmets had kind of a conical shape to them, so it made it accommodated a skull that was not natural like ours, or maybe theirs was natural and ours is unnatural. I don't know.
Well, and I've also heard that. Sorry to interrupt, Marshall. I've also heard that the Anunnaki were multiple races of beings, of space beings, not just one particular race. So have you found any validity to that, to what any of them look like?
I found that they were tall, blonde and blue-eyed. They were kind of Aryan in their features, and that is very consistent. They perhaps I have a theory of how the races occurred here on planet Earth. That during the 1,800,000 years of evolution of Homo erectus, they managed to cover the land surface and some water all over the planet, so that they morphed into many regions where the diet was different and the climate was different, and that species of Homo erectus adapted to these various environmental and food chain differences, and so that the 5 races that we have evolved through evolution from Homo erectus into the various parts of the world where we find them today. And then when the interaction between the Anunnaki and these human females took place, they produced offspring that had the characteristics of the part of the world that they came from. You know, from Asia, they were kind of slant-eyed and yellow and brown, and the Africans were sand-colored and dark brown, and the American Indians and the Eskimos, and all these different groupings that we have, I think, were products of evolution of Homo erectus. And then when they became Homo sapiens, they carried forward those characteristics so that we had different looking Homo sapiens today that didn't come from the Anunnaki directly, but came from the stock that was used to create them, the Homo erectus stock that had evolved in these different parts of the world. Now that's my theory, Rex. I have no proof of that, so I won't tell people that that's really what happened. I'm just saying, if you ask Marshall Klarfeld, that's his theory.
Okay. Now, when you get into the modern day extraterrestrial phenomenon, the first thing most people think of is the Greys. Some people think that they might actually be a synthetic android that is working for somebody else. Some people feel that they're actually natural, but because of their evolution or simply knowledge and no emotion, that they have giant heads now and very fragile bodies. What are your thoughts on the Greys, and do you feel that they might actually be a byproduct of the Anunnaki?
I'll be perfectly honest with you, Rex. I've never seen a Grey. I've never seen evidence of a Grey, and I can't speak about them because I have no research information that speaks to that at all. It's just I don't know where it came from. I have no research to identify this particular species called the Greys. And there's no evidence in the database that I rely on and that Zecharia relied on that there is such a species out there. Now, there are many reports of many things that many people claim to have seen and claim to have identified and claim to have experienced. I haven't had those experiences, Rex. I can't talk about it. I don't have any physical evidence in my research, and I don't have any real evidence in my own life. And I've lived a long time. I've seen a lot of things, but I've never seen a Grey.
Sure, absolutely. And there's also a lot of speculation that there's another particular presence of extraterrestrials. A lot of people call it the reptilian presence. And you've also talked about genetically modifying things back in the day that the Anunnaki did. Do you have any information on any type of reptilian species connected with that?
All I know about the reptilians were the dinosaurs. And,
Fair enough. I appreciate that.
They were here before we were, and fortunately for our species, it's really a remarkable story when you look at the history of this planet, and what's happened to it, and what the species have been on, and the exterminations of species goes on all the time. And we do have the fossil remains of these giant reptilian creatures we call the dinosaurs that were here 65 million years ago. But there are some, I live down in the desert just east of Palm Springs, and we have little birds that run around here. We call them road runners. Every time I see a roadrunner dash across the highway in front of me, I think, it's a throwback from the dinosaurs. He has a long tail, and he's got a very big feet, and he runs very fast, and he flies very little. But other than that, the reptilian thing, I think, maybe came from some of the cartoon depictions that we see from the ancient Sumerians and the Babylonians of fish-like people and heads, humans with heads of birds on them and heads of alligators maybe, or dogs or whatever. These depictions, I think, are like artist's work. It's just, like cartoons. That's my interpretation. I don't think that the Anunnaki actually, in their experimentation, came up with these crossbreeds that people sometimes give credit to. But I don't know. I can't with definity tell you anything about that, except what you see and how you interpret it. Now, there's an interesting thing I want to share with your audience, Rex. Many people ask me, what do the Anunnaki look like? And I said, well, if you look at the cylinder seals, they look like tall physical specimens, and they have large noses, and they have beards, some of them don't. And they're very muscular and very strong. And we look like them. They don't look like us. We look like them. And it's the story that they told about how we came into being that makes sense. We are their offspring. So why shouldn't we look like them?
We're in their image, too, as it says, I guess, in the Bible.
Exactly. George Norrie quoted that to me the other night on Coast to Coast. He said, yeah, created in their image.
And
very good, Rex.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Marshall. And if you look into some of the anomalies, I guess you could call them space anomalies, I'm wondering if any of these are written about in the texts that you're referring to in some of these Sumerian tablets and codexes. There's, you've got Phobos, Iapetus, Nemus. Phobos is what looks very much like an artificial moon that orbits Mars, and there's even been high political figures that have said that it's an artificial moon. Do you feel, if you know about it, do you feel that it is and that the Anunnaki possibly made it?
It is possible. There's nothing beyond my imagination that isn't possible, Rex. They were so talented, they were so far advanced that we still don't know what their tools were and how they built some of these things that I refer to in my books. But as far as artificial moons, sure, that's something they simply could build. They built motherships. In other words, they came to Earth from a distant planet, from their own planet, Nibiru. In order to get here, they had to do the things that we're trying to do, which is travel through space and time and go to distant places that are incredibly far away and overcome the voyage. But in order to do that, you had to have ships. And there's many references in the Bible and also in all of the Sumerian tablets of the chariots of the skies, the golden chariots, the flying carpets. And there are even pictures on temple beams at Karnak and Abydos temples, which I reproduced in my books, that shows helicopters, submarines, and shuttlecraft designs. And you wonder, who's the guy sitting up there 2,000, 3,000 years ago chiseling? What's he looking at to produce these objects? Or the other side of that coin is that the guys who built these temples used that as their signature. They just were playing with us and giving us a little peek into the future by illustrating their technology on these temple beams as kind of, here's what we did, this is what we can do. Someday you'll do that too. And if you look like things like the Nazca lines, Rex, which are huge biomorphs on the plain in Peru, 14,000 foot high plain, that are drawn so that you can only see them from the air.
Right.
Huge images that are visible, and we didn't see them until the 1920s when our airplanes started to fly over them. I said to myself, these guys were kind of clever. They knew that one day we would learn how to fly, so they left some messages for us on this plane. And I go into an analysis of what I think the story is on the Nazca plains, and that's part of my contribution, which is made up of my imagination and my engineering background as to how that could have been achieved. And I explain all that in my book so that folks who are interested in that can find those answers according to my speculations.
And when you talked about the mothership, is there any information that you've had access to that describes what it looks like, how big it is?
No, but we have a text during the Great Flood, that the Anunnaki left the surface of the earth and looked down at the flood and saw the devastation. So to me, they were in a ship someplace orbiting the earth watching the devastation, and there's conversations of what their emotions were, how they felt about what devastation was going on down below. So that's the evidence. And in my book, Mary and I took these translations and we created a screenplay, which we hope one day we can make into a film. And it depicts this. It starts out in the mothership. The story starts with a visit to the mothership and the conversation that goes on between the Anunnaki leaders as they look down onto the planet and the things that they're doing on Earth and how their responsibilities and their interference with the humans was taking place. So it transports the reader back 4,600 years to a time when we humans coexisted with these Anunnaki. And it's all in that story, the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's all part of the written record. And it's fascinating. It's called Gilgamesh 10. It's our second book.
And do you know exactly what caused the flood?
According to the record, according to the 11th tablet of the 12th tablet Epic of Gilgamesh, they were scientifically very knowledgeable, and they knew that every time their planet came into the inner orbit of Earth, it caused gravitational effects on the planet Earth. And at that time, they said that the Antarctic ice shelf had softened and was going to be drawn into the southern oceans by the force of Nibiru as it came through, and it was going to cause a gigantic tsunami, 1,000-foot high tsunami, which they knew was coming. And it's interesting, the story of how they dealt with that and how the two warring factions, the Enlilites and the Enkyites, dealt with the destruction of humankind. Enlil really wanted to get rid of us. He said, we're too noisy, we're diluting their bloodline, and we should get rid of all the humans and start over again. And Enki, interestingly in this story, which you've got to read to understand exactly how it happened, found a way to save us. That's the story of Noah in the Bible.
And
yes, to answer your question, yes, they knew it was coming, and they knew it was going to happen.
So, and basically the Ark, do you feel that was some type of spaceship or an actual just basic?
Here's the picture of it. On the Temple Beam I told you about, it was a submersible. They drew it. It was a submarine with a snorkel on it. And that's the only way you could survive a tsunami. If it just rained and the water went straight up, you could have an ark floating on top of it. But that isn't what was going to happen. They knew it was going to be a tidal wave, a tsunami. And in order to survive, you had to have a submersible that could tumble and survive in a wave condition like that. So there's a picture of it, and I reproduce it in the book.
Right.
The ark was a submersible.
Now that would make, logical sense. Absolutely. When you get to one deity in particular named Thoth, there is something called the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, and it's supposed to be very old texts. Have you been able to connect that and Thoth with the Anunnaki?
Oh, sure. Thoth was the son of Enki. Ningusada was his first name. And he's the designer of the pyramids. There's a direct translation in my new book, The Mysteries of Alien Technology, where I describe or I reproduce the translation that Zecharia made, where why the pyramids were built, where they were built, and who designed them. And this was the son of Enki, and his face was put on the Sphinx as a commemoration for the work he did. And later on, he became Thoth in Egypt. He was the ruler for 1,500 years until his brother Marduk exiled him out of Egypt, and he went to the New World, and he became Quetzalcoatl. So this career, this mention of Thoth, is his middle name. He became Quetzalcoatl in the New World and created the civilizations of the Incas, the Mayans, the Aztecs, and all those folks over there. So yeah, Thoth was a very influential Anunnaki, son of Enki. In fact, today, there's rumors. Now, I don't put much stock in this because I'm not a channeler and I can't go beyond the planet Earth and get information about what's going on in Nibiru, but there are folks who have been channeling that say that finally the ruler, Anu, the leader, has given up his throne on Nibiru, and that this same personality, Thoth, who came Quetzalcoatl, who was originally named Dosada, is now the head of the Anunnakis on Nibiru. For whatever that's worth, I don't put an awful lot of credence in it because I have no way of proving that. I don't think anybody does.
Well, obviously any type of channeling, whether it's legit or not, is going to be very difficult. So that's quite interesting, though. And from my research of Thoth and the Emerald Tablets, it seems quite noble, the tablets do, from what I've read. But I'm not obviously 100% sure, and I haven't done too much research into it. Now, another thing that I find fascinating is Thoth was also the bringer of, according to ancient texts, magic and writing and something about space understanding, correct?
Extremely talented individual. He designed the pyramids and the complexity of the interior of the Great Pyramids. And if he was able to create the beauty and magnificence for 1,500 years of his rule in Egypt, of the Egyptian civilization, and then he went on to the New World and became the leader of the mining operations there. They needed to find more minerals after the floods. His career was magnificent, and the Egyptians credit him with the time, the calendar, and mathematics, and many, many things. He was a multi-talented son of one of the most brilliant Anunnaki, who was Enki, the firstborn. I mean, it's a fascinating subject to me, as you can tell, and I'm perfectly willing to share it with as many people as possible because I wish that more people understood where we came from. And this history, predates the Bible by thousands and thousands of years. It's very important that people understand that this is really what happened to us. And once they understand that, maybe there's hope that we can learn to live together in peace.
Right. I feel that's very important, to work together and not continue to attack people based upon them having a mildly different belief in something.
Yeah.
Right. Very good point. Well, Marshall, it's probably late where you're at. It's late out here. If you'd like to call it a night, would love to have you back on again sometime.
Okay, we could talk about that. Excellent. Thanks very much for inviting me tonight. And good work. Keep up the good work. Keep investigating. It's important that you spread the word to as many people as possible. And if your audience is interested, please visit my webpage at adamthemissinglink.com for more information.
Absolutely. And thank you very much. You have a wonderful evening. Take care.
A very special thank you to our guest tonight. For all of you that had the opportunity to be here with us, if you enjoyed the show, follow us on YouTube, youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord, for the most recent interviews, videos, and podcasts. Or you can check us out on the World Wide Web, www.leakproject.com. Would you like to be a guest on our show? Do you have information that the world needs to see and hear? Send us an email, guestbookings@leakproject.com. Thank you, everybody. This is Rex Bear with Leak Project. Stay safe and be the change you want to see. Good night.